It's so funny how white folks are super upset about how Caitlin Clark is being treated, and I know that she's being taking cheap shots. I'm not trying to condone any of that, um, but it's funny when they come out and saying it's racism, and that yeah, that it's the same as the racism that people have experienced in the United States in the past, and that's just really funny. And they as I talk to them, they see it as like the individual incident of somebody treating you differently because of something. And even though there's a lot of white players in the WNBA, but not everybody's treated that way, they think that Caitlin Clark is being treated in a racist way, um, which is a really interesting discussion that I think we should get to talk about. um, but it's also really hilarious because I feel like it just shows how white people really don't know how deep and pervasive racism is and how deeply and impactful it is in somebody's life. And so to say that because Caitlin Clark is in the WNBA and being, of course, she's a really good player, talks a lot of trash, and because she's being singled out and, of course, taking cheap shots, which again, I don't condone, but that she's experiencing racism because of that. Again, I think this is where we need to really start getting into expecting more of our social sciences, of having more precision in our language, because yeah, racism, prejudice, discrimination, all of these terms, I think need to be figured out a little bit more, and like society as a whole needs to clarify these things, make them a lot more understandable so that we can all get on the same page. Because what they say is like any act that treats somebody different because of the way they look, they say if Caitlin Clark was a different race, that she would be getting treated differently in the WNBA. That she wouldn't be getting these cheap shots. This person was convinced that it's because of racism, and so clearly they have that in their head. They see racism. They're white. I very much certain that they have not experienced racism, because they would know that racism doesn't just happen on the basketball court. It happens all over. It happens in the doctor's office. It happens at the schools, at work, at the grocery store. It happens at the park. It happens when you talk to police or when you talk to different people, all sorts of people, especially if they're white. In a racist society, of course, that's what racism is based off of, race. Um, and so that, of course, like, it's a very pervasive thing how it affects people who are subjugated by racism. It's a very deep impact that creates mental health issues. People create hatred for themselves. They society tells them over and over that they are whatever, too much of or not enough of, and or this looks different. I mean, look at all the people that can't wear their hair the way that they just naturally grows, that they don't accept it, they don't want it, or even if they do, people around them don't want it or accept it. Even other people like them, of course, I'm talking about black people, and not being able to grow their hair naturally is wild. Is wild that society has pushed that on black people, especially in the U.S. And yeah, I mean, I'm sure that there's a lot of customs to black people doing their hair all over Africa, all over the world. But there were, I'm sure, back in the day, a long time ago, people had all sorts of customs for doing their hair, I'm sure. And yeah, maybe there were some ideas there of not having your hair, grow naturally, but I doubt they were what they are now. Yeah, especially amongst our society in the United States in 2024. I think we still need to talk a lot more about racism, and we need to get people to understand what racism is. Because people can be prejudiced. I think people can be discriminatory. Of course, anybody can be discriminated against. To me, that's like, prejudice is the to me the main thing. Looking at somebody and saying that you know anything about them because they look a certain way, or they act a certain way, or they have some sort of identity that they're presenting, and it's easy to see. yeah, you can get discriminated. Anybody can get discriminated. Again, I don't think any of this is good. I don't think prejudice or discrimination or racism is good. I don't, but I also don't think that race is a good thing either. I think race is, I mean, is not a is a false concept that, of course, is very real now. It has very real consequences, but it's a totally made up concept. It has no scientific, genetic, no sort of, yeah, veracity to it. It's not true. It's not a true concept. So it's specious reasoning from an old time that we still carry on to today. Um, and so to me the problem starts with there, because you start thinking, oh, because you look a certain way, I can assume these things about you. And everybody does that. Humans have done that, right? We use shortcuts all the time. Humans have used shortcuts all the time to and I'm sure we've been prejudiced and maybe even have had some sort of racism type deals, of course, in other places outside of like more modernish Western Europe. The last 500 years or 600 years or whatever. That they've been kind of dominated in colonizing the globe and spreading the idea of race, and building societies that value certain things more, sometimes often based on race as well. um, this idea of race, and yeah, all of this, I think we really need to redefine. We need to create clarity around this, because for people to say that Caitlin Clark, one of the richest, most beloved, like has the biggest fan bases in the world, or in the US, in women's sports, um, that she is being subjected to racism, I think is just shows a clear disconnect between the way I think about racism and the way that clearly other people think about racism. But I really think that the racism, yeah, I think that this is not racism. I think that we need to have these discussions to make progress, to make any sort of progress in feeling good about how to address the imbalances that have happened, the huge inequality that has happened and that continues to happen, while also recognizing that there's inequality right now that's other that's not only race based. There has been a lot of racial growth, a lot of racial, um, yeah, a ton of. There's been a ton of racial. I don't even know what to call it. There's more social harmony. Yeah, I don't even want to tie race to it, because yeah, I feel like race ties me up in a weird thing that I don't like. But like I just see boxes and people being put into boxes, and like weird pictures of like the stereotypical person of that race being put on top of their box, just like a picture of them, of like a face, and imagine all the different faces that we might be looking and thinking about, as the stereotypical white face or the stereotypical black face. It's like, it's such a weird thing to even start to think about. It kind of makes me feel gross. But there's just been a lot more social harmony. There's a lot more peace in the world right now than there has ever been. I think there's a lot more willingness to work together right now than there has ever been. But of course, we all know the media likes to zoom in on the fire that's happening in the corner, even if the rest of everything is pretty okay, um, and really blow stuff up. And of course, we know the history of the United States. Well, maybe sometimes we don't know the history of the United States. And another thing that we're gonna have to figure out is the this idea of your truth and my truth, and telling your truth, because and what's how to separate that from facts, even though it's really tricky, because oftentimes, um, yeah, it's all up to the interpretation of humans. So I do believe in scientific facts, and I think that's the standard for facts has to be really high. Um, And when people say like speak your truth, I think that is important that we acknowledge that there is an experience that people need to say and need to talk about genuinely and openly, and that other people need to listen when people do so. And really, everybody has their experience, so everybody needs to be afforded that time to speak their truth. I think when we talk about racism in particular, of course, you hear this huge imbalance of, yeah, just the recognition of rights and yeah, recognition of people's just humanities. That is, yeah, yeah, you see a huge imbalance in that's why people start to say, hey, wait a second, we have, third 20 15% black people in the country. They've been the main victims. They've been victimized the most by racism, for sure. Them and also Native Americans, Indian folks have been discriminated against terribly. Both of those groups have been subjugated probably more so than anybody, and have the most like socially weird stories and stigmas and little beliefs and little things like that. Yeah, just prejudices against them than everybody else. So we have like 15% black people, and we have 85% everybody else. We should give black people and American Indian people, Native Americans, we should give them time to talk a little bit more than if everybody got equal time. Because if everybody got equal time, then all the black folks and Indian folks would be drowned out by the sea of, a lot of white people and a lot of other people. Again, white people. Ugh, even white has changed. Even white has changed. The Irish were not white at first. Um, yeah. So we need to have these discussions. We need to talk about this. And yeah.